Who's Annatar? You've seen a couple of us Tolkien nerds simping over this man. Now you're wondering, who's this guy? This is Annatar. Now, who is Annatar? TLDR, Annatar is Sauron, one of the many forms of Sauron. Sauron is a shapeshifter, a deceiver, and Annatar is the guise that he takes up in the Second Age. Annatar is Quenya for Lord of Gifts, and he calls himself a messenger of the Valar. And in the Second Age, he takes up this disguise to try and lure the elves into his service. At first, he failed to gain welcome into Lindon because Gil-galad and Elrond knew something was up. Didn't know what exactly made them feel this distrust for Annatar, but they knew that he wasn't one that they wanted on their roster, so they said no thanks to being buds. However, Annatar was welcomed into Eregion because our little Celebrimbor baby is just too trusting, and Galadriel seemed to be the only person to be like, nah, Annatar ain't it. But again, she didn't know why. Now, Annatar and Celebrimbor began to spend a lot of time with each other, becoming besties, if you will. It's because of Annatar that Celebrimbor became one of the greatest elven smiths, second only to his grandfather Feanor. And it was under Annatar's guidance that the Rings of Power were created. Not the 3 elven rings that we see first in Rings of Power, but the 16 Rings of Power that are eventually given to the dwarves and men. And I use quotations around the 3 elven Rings of Power because all 19 Rings of Power were originally meant for elves, so they're all technically elven Rings of Power, but we'll get into that later. Now, the 3 Rings of Power that stay with the elves, Nenya, Narya, and Vilya, were created only by Celebrimbor, so Sauron had no hand in making them. And it's because of those 3 rings that the elves were able to perceive Sauron's 1 ring of power that was created to control the bearers of the other rings. So the elves took all 19 Rings of Power and hid them. All of this eventually leading to Galadriel, Gil-galad, and Círdan getting Nenya, Vilya, and Narya. It also leads to what's called the Black Years, the sack of Eregion, Sauron regaining the 16 Rings of Power, and the eventual Celebrimbor banner, which I've explained in a previous video here. And after all those fun times and fleeing back to Mordor, Sauron works on regaining his strength, gaining the rule over the men in the south and east in Middle-earth, and also building temples to Morgoth. He once again takes up the disguise of Annatar, and in this fair form, he hands out the 7 Rings of Power to the dwarves and the 9 Rings of Power to men. And while the dwarves don't fall under the control of Sauron, the men do, which ultimately leads those 9 men to become the Nazgul. The Númenóreans get wind that someone in Middle-earth is calling themselves King of Men and Lord of the Earth. The Númenóreans are like, no, you're coming with us, buddy. And they take Annatar as prisoner. Well, Annatar lets them take him as prisoner. And they don't know that Annatar is Sauron. And not long after being taken to Númenor, Annatar works his way up to become advisor to Ar-Pharazôn. He converts some Númenóreans to Morgothism, has this giant temple built in the name of Morgoth. And it's with the king's fear of death that Annatar convinces him to start a war with the Valar, literal gods. Men will just fall for literally anything. Ar-Pharazôn amasses an army of ships and they set sail to Aman. Meanwhile, Annatar is just kicking it back in Númenor. And it's because of this bright idea Eru Ilúvatar gets PO'd, and he floods Númenor, ultimately destroying it. And joke's on Sauron, because in destroying Númenor, his physical body also got destroyed. Because of all of that, while Sauron's spirit and his Ring of Power endured the destruction of Númenor, he's never able to take on a fair form such as Annatar again, which I've touched on in this video here. But yeah, that's a long explanation as to who Annatar is. Obviously, most of this happens outside the original trilogy, which is why some of us were hesitant to be hopeful as to if we'd even see Annatar in the 2nd season of Rings of Power, and why some of us absolutely lost our shit when we saw him in the trailer for season 2. Me being one of those people. Because the show writers only have so many rights from the Tolkien estate as to what they can and can't put in the show. And it'll probably be a cold day in Mordor when someone gains the full rights to the Silmarillion. And the Rings of Power is set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, which already there isn't a lot written as to what happens in the Second Age, and there's even less of what's written about the Second Age included in production rights, which is why Rings of Power isn't as book accurate as some people like to criticize. Creative liberties aside, it's because they can't make it as accurate as we want them to. Now, hopefully my rambling answered any questions you might have when it comes to Annatar, but if you do still have more, feel free to comment.